And needless to say, many people will consider the color of my skin to be disqualifying here. I could have invited any number of great black intellectuals onto this podcast to make these points for me. But that struck me as a form of cowardice. Glenn Loury, John McWhorter, Thomas Chatterton Williams, Coleman Hughes, Camille Foster. These guys might not agree with everything I'm about to say, but any one of them could walk the tightrope I'm now stepping out on far more credibly than I can. But you see, that's part of the problem, right? The perception that the color of a person's skin, or even his life experience, matters for this discussion is a pernicious illusion. Yet for the discussion we really need to have, the color of a person's skin, and even his life experience, simply does not matter. It cannot matter. We have to break the spell that the politics of identity has cast over everything. Take wealth inequality, for example. The median white family has a net worth of around $170,000. These data are a couple of years old, but I think they're pretty close to what's true now. The median black family has a net worth of around $17,000. So we have a tenfold difference in median wealth. Now that's the median, not the mean. So half of white families are below $170,000 and half above. Half of black families are below $17,000 and half above. And we're talking about wealth here, not income. And this disparity in wealth persists even for people whose incomes are in the top 10% of the income distribution. For whites in the top 10% for income, the median net worth is $1.8 million. For blacks, it's around $350,000. Now, there are probably many things that account for this disparity in wealth. It seems that black families who make it into the top 10% of the distribution fall out more easily than white families do. But it's also undeniable that black families have less intergenerational wealth accumulated through inheritance. Now, how much of this inequality is due to the legacy of slavery? And how much of it is due to the ensuing century of racist policies? I'm prepared to think quite a lot. And it strikes me as totally legitimate to think about paying reparations as a possible remedy here. Of course, one will then need to talk about reparations for the Native Americans. And then one wonders where all this ends, right? And what about blacks who aren't descended from slaves, but who still suffered some consequences of racism? In listening to people like John McWhorter and Coleman Hughes discuss this topic, I'm inclined to think that reparations is probably unworkable as a policy. But the truth is I'm genuinely unsure about this. Whatever we decide about the specific burdens of the past, we have to ask, how much of current wealth inequality is due to existing racism and to existing policies that make it harder for black families to build wealth? And the only way to get answers to those questions is to have a dispassionate discussion about facts. But in the last 25 years, violent crime has come down significantly in the U.S., and so has the police use of deadly force. And as you're about to see, the police use more deadly force against white people, both in terms of absolute numbers and in terms of their contribution to crime and violence in our society. But the public perception is, of course, completely different. I mean, in a city like Los Angeles, 2019 was a 30-year low for police shootings. Think about that. Do the people who were protesting in Los Angeles, peacefully and violently, and do the people who were ransacking and burning businesses by the hundreds, in many cases businesses that will not return to their neighborhoods, do the people who cause so much damage to the city that certain neighborhoods will take years and probably decades to recover, do the celebrities who supported them and even bailed them out of jail, do any of these people know that 2019 was the 30-year low for police shootings in Los Angeles? Many of you are going to feel a visceral negative reaction to what I'm about to say. You're not going to like the way it sounds. You're especially not going to like the way it sounds coming from a white guy. This feeling of not liking, this feeling of outrage, this feeling of disgust, this feeling of, Sam, what the fuck is wrong with you? Why are you even touching this topic? This feeling isn't an argument. It isn't, or shouldn't be, the basis for your believing anything to be true or false about the world. Your capacity to be offended isn't something that I or anyone else needs to respect. Your capacity to be offended isn't something that you should respect. In fact, it's something that you should be on your guard for. Perhaps more than any other property of your mind, this feeling can mislead you. If you care about justice, and you absolutely should, you should care about facts and the ability to discuss them openly. Justice requires contact with reality. It simply isn't the case, it cannot be the case, that the most pressing claims on our sense of justice need come from those who claim to be most offended by conversation itself. So I'm going to speak in the language of facts now, insofar as we know them, all the while knowing that these facts run very much counter to most people's assumptions. Many of the things you think you know about crime and violence in our society are almost certainly wrong, and that should matter to you. So just take a moment to think this through with me. How many people are killed each year in America by cops? Now, if you don't know, guess, right? See if you have any intuition for these numbers. Because your intuitions determine how you interpret horrific videos of the sort we saw coming out of Minneapolis. The answer for many years running is about 1,000. Okay, 1,000 people are killed by cops in America each year. There are about 50 to 60 million encounters between civilians and cops each year, and about 10 million arrests. That's down from a high of over 14 million arrests annually through the 90s. So of the 10 million occasions where a person attracts the attention of the police, and the police decide to make an arrest, about 1,000 of those people die as a result. I'm sure a few people get killed when there's no arrest attempted, but that has to be a truly tiny number. So, without knowing anything else about the situation, if the cops decide to arrest you, it is reasonable to think that your chance of dying is around 1 in 10,000. Now, of course, in the United States, it's higher than it is in other countries. So I'm not saying this number is acceptable, but it is what it is for a reason, as we're about to see. Now, there are a few generic points I want to make before we get further into these data, and they should be uncontroversial. First, it's almost certainly the case that of these 1,000 officer-caused deaths each year, some are entirely justified. Right? It may even be true that most are entirely justified, and some are entirely unjustified, and some are much harder to judge. And that will be true next year and the year after that. Of the unjustified killings, there are vast differences between them. Many have nothing in common but for the fact that a cop killed someone unnecessarily. It might have been a terrible misunderstanding, or incompetence, or just bad luck. In certain cases, it could be a cop who decides to murder someone because he's become enraged, or he's just a psychopath, right? And it is certainly possible that racial bias accounts for some number of these unjustified killings. And among innocent people, and perhaps this is getting more common these days, a person might feel that resisting arrest is the right thing to do, ethically or politically, or perhaps as a matter of affirming his identity. After all, put yourself in his shoes. He did nothing wrong, right? Why are the cops arresting him? I don't know if we have data on the numbers of people who resist arrest by race, but I can well imagine that if it's common for African Americans to believe that the only reason they have been singled out for arrest is due to racism on the part of the police, that could lead to greater levels of noncompliance, which seems very likely to lead to more unnecessary injury and death. And this is certainly one reason why it's wise to have the racial composition of a police force mirror that of the community it's policing. Now, unfortunately, there's no evidence that this reduces lethal violence from the side of the police. In fact, the evidence we have suggests that Black and Hispanic cops are more likely to shoot Black and Hispanic suspects than white cops are. But it would surely change the perception of the community that racism is the likely explanation for police behavior, which itself might reduce conflict. The main problem with using individual cases where Black men and women have been killed by cops to conclude that there's an epidemic of racist police violence in our society is that you can find nearly identical cases of white suspects being killed by cops, and there are actually more of them. In 2016, John McWhorter wrote a piece for Time magazine about this, and here's a snippet of what he wrote. Quote, "The heart of the indignation over these murders is a conviction that racist bias plays a decisive part in these encounters. That has seemed plausible to me, and I've recently challenged those who disagree to present a list of white people killed within the past few years under circumstances similar to those that so enrage us in cases such as what happened to Tamir Rice, John Crawford, Walter Scott, Sam DuBose, and others." End quote. So McWhorter issued that challenge, as he said, and he was presented with the cases. But there's no song about these people admonishing us to say their names. And the list of white names is longer. And I don't know any of them, right, other than Tony Timpa. I know the Black names. In addition to the ones I just read from McWhorter's article, I know the names of Eric Garner and Michael Brown and Alton Sterling and Philando Castile. And now, of course, I know the name of George Floyd. And I'm aware of many of the details of these cases where Black men and women have been killed by cops. I know the name of Breonna Taylor. I can't name a single white person killed by cops in circumstances like these, other than Timpa. And I just read McWhorter's article, where he lists many of them. So this is also a distortion in the media, right? The media is not showing us videos of white people being killed by cops. Activists are not demanding that they do this, right? I'm sure white supremacists talk about this stuff a lot. Who knows? But in terms of the story we're telling ourselves in the mainstream, we're not actually talking about the data on lethal police violence. So back to the data. Again, cops kill around 1,000 people every year in the United States. About 25% are Black. About 50% are white. Now, the data on police homicide are all over the place. The federal government does not have a single repository for data of this kind, but they've been pretty carefully tracked by outside sources like the Washington Post, at least for the last 5 years or so. And this ratio between Black and white appears stable over time. And again, many of these killings are justifiable, right? We're talking about career criminals who are usually armed and in many cases trying to kill the cops. Those aren't the cases we're worried about. We're worried about the unjustified homicides. Now, some people will think these numbers still represent an outrageous injustice. After all, African Americans are only 13% of the population. So at most, they should be 13% of the victims of police violence, not 25%. And any departure from the baseline population must be due to racism. Okay, well, that sounds plausible, but consider a few more facts. Blacks are 13% of the population, but they commit at least 50% of the murders and other violent crimes. Now, if you have 13% of the population responsible for 50% of the murders, and in some cities committing 2/3 of all violent crime, what percent of police attention should it attract? I honestly don't know. But I'm pretty sure it's not just 13%. And given that the overwhelming majority of their victims are black, I'm pretty sure that most black people wouldn't set the dial at 13% either. And here we arrive somewhere near the core of the problem. The story of crime in America is overwhelmingly the story of black-on-black crime. It is also, in part, a story of black-on-white crime. But for more than a generation, it really has not been much of a story of white-on-black crime. Now, the murder rate has come down steadily since the 1990s, with only minor upticks. But nationwide, blacks are 6 times more likely to get murdered than whites. And in some cities, their risk is double that. And around 95% of these murders are committed by members of the African American community. The weekend these protests and riots were kicking off nationwide, when our entire country seemed to be tearing itself apart over a perceived epidemic of racist police violence against the black community, 92 people were shot and 27 killed in Chicago alone, right? One city. This is almost entirely a story of black men killing members of their own community. And this type of violence is far more representative of the kind of violence the black community needs to worry about. And ironically, it's clear that one remedy for this violence would be effective policing. But Roland Fryer, the Harvard economist whose work I once discussed with Glenn Lowry on the podcast, he studied police encounters involving black and white suspects and the use of force. His paper is titled, and this is from 2016, An Empirical Analysis of Racial Differences in Police Use of Force. And Fryer is black, and he went into this research with the expectation that the data would confirm that there's an epidemic of lethal police violence directed against black men, especially. But he didn't find that. However, he did find support for the idea that black people suffer more non-lethal violence at the hands of cops than whites do. So let's look at this. The study examined data from 10 major police departments in Texas, Florida, and California. Generally, Fryer found that there's a 25% greater likelihood that the police would go hands-on black suspects than white ones, cuffing them or forcing them to the ground or using other non-lethal force. Specifically in New York City, in encounters where black and white citizens were matched for other characteristics, they found that cops were 17% more likely to go hands-on black suspects, 18% more likely to push them into a wall, 16% more likely to put them in handcuffs in a situation where they weren't being arrested, 18% more likely to push them to the ground, 25% more likely to use pepper spray or a baton, 19% more likely to draw their guns, and 24% more likely to point a gun at them. So this is more or less the full continuum of violence, short of using lethal force. And it seems, based on the data we have, that blacks receive more of it than whites. So what accounts for this disparity? Racism? Maybe. However, as I said, it's inconvenient to note from other data that suggests that black cops and Hispanic cops are more likely to shoot black and Hispanic suspects than white cops are. I'm not sure how an ambient level of racism explains that. Are there other explanations? Well, again, it could be that blacks are less cooperative with the police. And if so, this would be worth understanding. A culture of resisting arrest would be a very bad thing to cultivate, given that the only response to such resistance is for the police to increase their use of force. Now, whatever is true here is something that we should want to understand. And it's all too easy to see how an increased number of encounters with cops, due to their policing in the highest crime neighborhoods, which are disproportionately black, and an increased number of traffic stops in those neighborhoods, and an increased propensity for cops to go hands-on these suspects, with or without an arrest, for whatever reason, it's easy to see how all of this could be the basis for a perception of racism, whether or not racism is the underlying motive. And it's totally humiliating to be arrested or manhandled by a cop. And given the level of crime in the black community, it seems that a disproportionate number of innocent black men are guaranteed to have this experience, right? And it's totally understandable that this would make them bitter and mistrustful of the police. This is another vicious circle we have to find some way to interrupt. But Fryer also found that black suspects are around 25% less likely to be shot than white suspects are. And in the most egregious situations, where an officer was not first attacked, but nevertheless fired his weapon at a suspect, the police seem more likely to do this when the suspect is white. Again, these data are incomplete. This doesn't cover every city in the country, and a larger study tomorrow might paint a different picture. But as far as I know, the best data we have suggests that for whatever reason, whites are more likely to be killed by cops once an arrest is attempted. And a more recent study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by David Johnson and colleagues found similar results. And given the data we have, it seems undeniable that more whites are killed by cops each year, again, both in absolute numbers and in proportion to their contributions to crime and violence in our society. So there's a real question about how we can reform police departments and get rid of bad cops without negatively impacting the performance of good cops. That's a riddle we have to solve, or at least we have to understand what the trade-offs are here. And why is all this happening now? Police killings of civilians have gone way down, and they are very rare events. They are 1 in 10,000 level events, if measured by arrests, and 1 in 50 to 60,000 level events, if measured by police encounters. And the number of unarmed people who are killed by cops is much smaller than that, right? Of the 1,000 people killed by cops last year, around 50 were unarmed. And again, there were more white people killed than black. And not all unarmed victims are innocent, right? Some get killed in the act of attacking the cops. Again, the data don't tell a clean story or the whole story. I see no reason to doubt that African Americans get more attention from the cops. Though, honestly, given the distribution of crime in our society, I don't know what the alternative to that would be. And once the cops get involved, blacks are more likely to get roughed up, it seems, which is bad, right? But again, it's simply unclear that racism is the cause of that. And contrary to everyone's expectations, it seems that whites are more likely to get killed by cops. Actually, one factor seems to be that whites are 7 times more likely to commit what's called suicide by cop. And they're actually 3 times more likely to commit suicide generally. What's going on there? Who knows? There's a lot we don't understand about these data. But ask yourself, would society seem less racist to you if the disparity ran the other way? Is less physical contact, but a greater likelihood of getting shot and killed, a form of white privilege? Is a higher level of suicide by cop and suicide generally a form of white privilege? We have a problem here that, read either way, you could tell a starkly racist narrative. We need ethical, professional policing, of course, right? But the places with the highest crime in our society need the most of it. Is there any doubt about that? I mean, in a city like Milwaukee, blacks are 12 times more likely to get murdered than whites. And again, they're being killed by other African Americans nearly 100% of the time. I think the lowest figure I've seen is 93% of the time. What should the police do about this? And what are they likely to do now? Now that our entire country has been convulsed over one horrific case of police misconduct. So we need to lower the temperature on this conversation and many other conversations, and to understand what is actually happening in our society. But instead of doing this, we now have a whole generation of social activists who seem eager to play a game of chicken with the forces of chaos. I mean, everything I just said about the problem of inequality and the need for reform stands. But I think what we're witnessing in our streets and on social media, and even in the mainstream press, is a version of mass hysteria. And the next horrific video of a black person being killed by cops won't be evidence to the contrary.